Hello and welcome to this special series leading up to the ICICI Lombard Risk Manager Awards. On the show today, our focus is on how companies can align risk strategies with business strategies. A quick round of introductions of our panel. Tapan Ray, who's Executive Director, Risk Advisory Services, PwC. A. Dhananjay, Chief Compliance and Risk Officer, Financial Services with the Aditya Birla Group. And S. Venkatraman, Managing Director, Wealth Street. Gentlemen, great to have you here. Let's, start with a pretty fundamental question. And I'm going to ask the same question to each one of you. But you first. Do most companies in India recognize the importance of risk management?
Yes, I think they do. Although the degree of recognition may vary from company to company or industry to industry. Typically, there are certain industries where the awareness, understanding and appreciation of risks is greater than in others. So in financial services, for example, the industry where I work, there's a great degree or a much higher degree of awareness and appreciation for the whole concept of risk, the management of risk, the identification of risk and the rest of it. But that's not to say that companies outside financial services do anything inferior. I think intuitively everyone across all industries has a feel for how much they are willing to lose in their lines of business. And that in a very rough sense is a comprehensive definition of risk. So I would say yes, everybody does have in some shape or form a good understanding of the risks they face.
Okay, we'll talk about that definition and the various facets to it in a moment. But same question to you. Do you think companies in India have a sort of conscious risk approach, risk minimization strategy?
Yeah, I think so. And one has also seen that this has evolved over a period of time. And if one goes back, I think increasingly one sees that the definition and awareness of risk is actually increasing as each passing year, and more so in times of post 2008, when you don't know what you will be hit with. I think there is a conscious recognition to the fact that one needs to be aware of the risks that companies are facing and be prepared for the consequences.
But I guess the awareness would be the most in, say, a
Absolutely.
sector like financial services. But across sectors, do you come across a close second?
Yes, I wouldn't say any particular sector. Financial services sector, obviously, it's there.
It stands apart.
It stands apart, but one is saying that even in consumer and industrial product space, because they are exposed to risks regarding commodities, forex, and that is something one is seeing that it's increasing.
Big business, small business. You have the advantage of having a finger on the pulse of smaller sized businesses. Mm-hmm. Would you say that they're giving risk strategies adequate importance?
I'd like to define the sensitivity to risk in terms of the way the economy is doing. I think in good times, when business is prospering, I think there is a lesser propensity or a tendency or incentive for promoters and risk managers to take care of risk, because the profits that you make is adequately large to be able to absorb the mistakes that happen because risk is not managed correctly. But in times like this, which is slightly recessionary, where the business optimism isn't very high, I think the mistakes of not taking care of risk management comes back to haunt a lot of businesses, right? And which is where the consciousness of having a proper risk management strategy, which is aligned to your business strategy, comes to the fore, and people begin to take it a little bit more seriously.
I mean, something simple like, or fundamental if you like how many have dedicated teams, or is that an irrelevant measure? Tapan?
When one started off, and I think I have been in this practice for quite some time, I mean, it was more about knowing what is risk, know, and then it evolved about making it a part of a function, a business function, and then one sees that increasingly there is a separate function known as the risk and compliance function. Whether that is desirable or that is something to debate, because when you have a separate function, it becomes more process driven and a tick in the box kind of approach, where identifying and managing risk or responding to the risk becomes almost someone else's job. Oh, I have a risk department, and that becomes and it is not integrated into business strategy, process, its people, and its cultures.
But at the end of the day, it really boils down to whether or not the board, the top executive team, is pushing, backing, monitoring, and evaluating, risk practices, isn't it?
Completely agree with that, because the whole tone is set by the behavior and approach of the top management, shareholders, and the board. So if there is a pronounced recognition and acceptance of risk and understanding of risk and a well-defined approach to identifying and managing the risk, the whole organization moves in that direction. And the reverse is also probably true. The other thing I'd like to mention in this context is that management of risk is not confined to the risk management team. It belongs to each and every employee of the organization who has to understand and manage the risks that he is a part of.
Can you share with us an example of how it works at the Aditya Birla Group, aligning your risk strategy with business strategy? Just the nuts and bolts. How do you, frame it?
Just to give you an example of the way we deal with risk, and the example I'd like to start with is let's say launching a new product.
Yeah.
So let's say in any one of our lines of business, take life insurance for instance, and we have a large life insurance business within the Aditya Birla Group. Let's say they want to launch a new product. It has various dimensions. It has a pricing dimension, it has an actuarial dimension, it has a distribution dimension, it has a legal and a regulatory dimension, and so on. So whoever has conceived of or designed the product has to do a rigorous assessment of the risks from each of these dimensions. So how does that work in practice? The product has to be evaluated from the perspective of the product guys, from the perspective of the actuarial officer, from the distribution team, and so on and so forth. So each of them looks at their respective dimension of the product, makes sure that their risks are properly identified and suitably mitigated, and whatever residual risk might remain is within acceptable boundaries. And once the entire set of stakeholders of that particular product are satisfied and comfortable with the risk which is going to remain within the product, it goes for a formal sign off or an approval from whichever is the empowered forum within the company. So the real key to success, or the way we like to run it, is to be able to get your hands around the risk that you're dealing with, understand the risks that you are facing, measure it, and make sure that they are mitigated to the extent that the residual risk remains within an acceptable boundary, and then go to market.
Okay, we're going to hold that thought, take a quick break. When we come back, we'll look at best practices of aligning risk with business strategy in sectors beyond financial services. That's in a moment. Welcome back to this special series leading up to the ICICI Lombard Risk Manager Awards. Today we're focusing on how you can align risk strategies with business strategies. We've talked about financial services and we've drawn on the Aditya Birla Group experiences, the nuts and bolts. You've described them for us. Tapan, can you go beyond? When we're talking about best practices, get the nuts and bolts of these best practices?
I think increasingly one is seeing that risk is not a separate function. It has to be built into the strategy, and the key and also the fact that one has to be awareness level in the company or organization has to come not from the top but also from the bottom. So it is increasingly, so you need to have the right risk philosophy, a clear definition of risk, a uniform approach towards risk. You need to have a proper process as to how you go about identifying risk, how you go about prioritizing your risk, and what infrastructure that you have in place so that risks, as soon as they come to the fore, that you are actually alerted to that fact. In respect of that, one would also like to see that you need to be aware of the linkages. You know, it is not just one unit or one division. The linkages between various division and various subsidiaries when it comes to the group level, that has to be brought into the picture. So you need to have a full portfolio view of risk rather than a discrete view of risk.
So you've said, you know, you've underlined integration, and you've underlined, well, a holistic view and communicating that view. Easier said than done, I imagine, right? You're
absolutely right. It is easier said than done. And for that to happen, and I would go back to the point that the tone at the top, how serious are you at? Because most of the time, you spend a lot of time on strategy. You spend a lot of time on performance evaluation. You do that, and you look at business results, but do you really spend that much amount of time, I'm talking of here boards and top executives, on the risks that you face if you are adopting a particular strategy? What are the risks that you will face in terms of, so do you spend adequate time in that space or not? So
I get the sense from you that perhaps not enough time is spent on assessing the risk, but we'll pause there for a moment, because Venkat, you could turn their insights on their head, right? Because they're still talking from a larger organization point of view. What is best practice when it comes to small and medium-sized businesses? Because they don't have the wherewithal, the energy, and the resources to even think about risks. Operations and profitability ends up overwhelming and overcrowding everything else.
What varies is the implementation capability, right? So larger organizations can conceive a plan, and they have the necessary structures and processes, and most importantly, the past experience to be able to guide them through the next wave of challenges, right? But for a smaller organization, that can sometimes be a challenge, right? So let's look at, say, Forex volatility, right? It's probably once in 100-year kind of a scenario.
But I mean, the last few months have been crippling for many companies.
Crippling, right? So it's kind of moved 40-45% against probably our most important trading partner. This kind of situation, probably most of the promoters of the companies that we deal with haven't really faced in their lives. Probably their fathers and grandfathers haven't faced it either. So there isn't any past parameter sometimes to guide you through some of these issues. So in terms of best practices, we like to look at two things. One, what is a promoter's mindset, right? While it's important to understand what risk you're going to take, I think it's very important for promoters to also decide what risk you will not take, right? So deciding to stay away from certain types of risk is very important for promoters, right? Because when you're typically an entrepreneur-driven organization, the tendency is to go out and do more, right? And the belief is that you understand the next thing that's going to happen, and you believe you got a solution for it. But that's a bit of a trap, right? Because you can't be equally good at managing every kind of risk. So sometimes, it's important to pause, recognize your limitations, and say, look, this is what I'm really good at, right? And this is where I understand, this is the domain in which I understand the risk, right? And stay away from the
That's the ideal approach, right? But
right.
I mean, is it practical? Is it happening? Is there a consciousness building up?
I think consciousness is building up. I think the market has punished those who have kind of chosen to go beyond, the knowledge domain. The other aspect of best practice is also about the measurement mechanisms, right? So what we look for is, if you can't measure something, it's extremely difficult to control it, almost impossible to control it, right? And again, every organization is faced with risk that it cannot measure, right? Business risk is sometimes very difficult to measure, right? But there is no excuse for not measuring the risks that are measurable, right? And that's what a lot of corporates are guilty of not doing correctly. Right? So whatever is measurable, I think it's important to do it. So let's take an example. Let's look at something like credit risk. How much credit do you want to extend to your distributor, your dealer, or your customer? It's important for organizations to arrive at conscious decisions on what those credit limits are. Because in difficult times, payments will get delayed. They get delayed beyond a point, disputes will arise. You will ultimately end up in a situation of non-recovery or a settlement that will mean you're going to get less than what you should be getting, right? The loss that a company takes is because you chose not to measure what the credit limit should be and have a policy around it.
And
by
that was
customer.
clearly a measurable one.
Clearly
You've
measurable
alluded to it over the last few minutes, but I wanted you to pointedly sort of define how a company can measure risk appetite, its own risk appetite.
In very simplistic terms, risk appetite is nothing but the amount of risk that the promoter is willing, the amount of capital he is willing to, lose, in very, very simplistic terms. So once I have either a measured or an intuitive sense of how much I'm willing to lose, everything, moves towards that or operates within the boundaries laid down by that number or by that figure. In more scientific terms, different organizations obviously would measure it differently, but you would have certain financial and certain non-financial attributes which define your risk appetite. And you would constantly and on an ongoing basis measure your performance or the actuals vis-a-vis the thresholds that you have set for yourself. And if you feel that you're crossing the boundaries, you have to scale back, you have to pull back now and then to make sure that you do not go beyond the appetite that you have set for yourself. Now, risk appetite is again a moving target. You would dynamically keep adjusting it depending on the circumstances surrounding you, depending on the market, depending on regulation, depending on government policy and 100 other factors. But it's important for you to have a clear idea in your own mind about what are the boundaries beyond which I will not operate. How much am I willing to lose and beyond what am I not willing to lose? So that in a very, very loose sense is what I call risk appetite, or what we define as risk appetite in our organization. And we believe that every business needs to define this for itself such that they are not operating in darkness. They are not moving blind. They are moving with they are progressing in their business towards their targets or towards their goals with a very clear definition of beyond what will they not go. To what extent are they willing to push the envelope, and where will they draw a line and stop?
Tapan, I'm going to pose the question to you. We're going to take a short break. You'll have time to think about it, and when we come back, we'll address it. Can you think of any examples right here in India, in sectors beyond financial services, that show the benefits of aligning risk strategies with business strategies and the big payoff that it yielded? That's the question. We'll have the answer when we return in a moment. Welcome back. Our focus today is on understanding what are the benefits that can accrue to a company if it aligns its risk strategy with its business strategy. I had put that question to you when we took a break. Something real that you've encountered where, risk came into the consciousness of a company, yielded results that it hadn't anticipated before.
Yeah, I would just flip that question around, if I may, in
Sure, go
terms
ahead.
of you talk about benefits, but here one is a live example. I go back maybe 2-3 years back, and this is a mid-sized company, and it had never embarked on an exercise of risk identification, and it thought it was increasingly important, and it was something that it had the blessings of the board and the top management, and an exercise was undertaken. And coming out of that entire exercise and the risk identification process was the fact that this company had invested heavily into a new plant, and one of those critical components of that, and this plant was, one of the components had to be imported, and the lead time for that was almost 3 to 4 months. So when one embarked on the exercise, one identified that what could go wrong, if this particular component, which has a lead time of 3 to 4 months, from the day you actually order it. If something happens to that, if it breaks down, then your entire plant is at risk. So this exercise and this risk was actually identified, and you wouldn't believe this actually happened. So the entire exercise of identifying the risk at that point in time became extremely critical. The company became wiser, and now the entire risk identifications, management and response thereof is totally evolved and gets the proper board attention.
Gentlemen, we're out of time, but I'm going to ask you for final words of advice, thoughts. In summary, Venkat, would you like to go first? In the context, of course, of aligning risk practices with business strategy.
Sure. So I would just like to leave with one practical, very doable, implementable solution. I think risk, end of the day, is a consequence of what you don't know, right? And I think it's important for companies to introspect and be aware of what they're doing, right? And while it looks completely intuitive and logical, I think just in the